that history. And that concept then comes to be applied in variety of geographical or as well as historical locations. So that is what is very, very central to anything which emerges as a concept. Here in this case, when we are discussing minority, I would suggest that we also go into the conceptual history of minority, which I'll try to take you during the course of this discussion. But let us see the sort of a paradox which we are faced with. According to the census, there are 1,600 speech communities. And out of these 1,600 speech communities, more than 33 are 1 million strong. That is more than 10 lakh speakers of these languages. There are more than 3,000 castes listed by, say, for example, the Mandal Commission, as well as different commissions, and more than 350 tribal groupings. Besides, India is also home to almost all the world's major religions. Although you may say that Muslims are a minority here, the largest minority, but they constitute 14.1% of the population, nearly 200 million, which is a huge number, and it is considered to be third highest in the world. So in that sense, you can say it is one of the largest conglomeration of Muslims or concentration of Muslims is in India. The Sikhs are hardly 1 or 2% of the population. But when you come to Punjab, they are a majority constituting nearly 60% of the population. The Christians, again, hardly 2.3%. They're spread out in different parts of the country. But yet, there are those small states, but there are 3 states in the country, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Nagaland, which are Christian majority. And Christians have a substantial share in the population of, say, Kerala, in also Arunachal Pradesh, and certain other places. So, therefore, the demography itself makes the question about determining a minority extremely difficult. Now, this difficulty is also for the fact that if we go state-wise, for instance, there are various places in which Hindus may not themselves be a majority, although 80% of the population. Whereas those which are seen as classically a minority in India, the National Minority Commission recognizes them, but they may be a majority in certain states in India. All right. Now, there is also a certain kind of obfuscation or because of conflation, which is overlaps. That minority is a term which has been now begun to be used for a variety of references. Very often you will hear that women, particularly a section of feminists, declaring women to be a minority on account of their powerlessness. So irrespective of what religion, ethnicity, racial origin women belong to, women as a category are minority according to certain feminist scholars, because they are assumed to be powerless. Although women could be 50% of the population in many countries. Similarly, nowadays, the term sexual minority is used to refer to those kinds of groups which have non-heterosexual practices, particularly the LGBT category. And this category 2 is referred to as a minority, as a sexual minority. In disability studies, again, the term minority is used for the disabled bodies, or disabled are tried to be brought under the rubric of a minority. Certain scholars have come to use even caste groups, particularly the lower castes, as a minority. In the draft constitution before the emergence of the constitution which we see today, in the draft constitution of India, minority was an umbrella kind of a category which included religious as well as religious communities which were a minority, as well as the depressed castes such as the Dalits. Today whom we refer to as Dalits, such as the scheduled tribes, etc. So, there is a certain amount of a complexity or confusion regarding what constitutes a minority. And this makes our task difficult to, to simply then rely on any one definition and thus be able to clear our doubts. Now, I'll try to just here give a brief account of where the question of minority emerges from. In the early references to minority protection, although the term minority was rarely used, say for example, in the millet system of Ottoman Empire, there's certain amount of cultural autonomy guaranteed to those who were, the non-Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, the Armenians, etc. That is the millet system. But in this, while they were given cultural autonomy, which meant that they could continue with their own way of life, religious as well as cultural, but at the same time, the minority did not have equal status as that of the Turks, in the sense that they could not take political offices. French and American revolutions later on in the late 18th century, to a certain extent, made a right to freedom of religion, etc., as a important right. But again, the minority as an equal citizen, at the same time, free to practice his or her own way of life, was not something which was conceded to. The history of the emergence of a minority as a problem is often linked to the Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia was signed in 1648. This treaty, the students of political science or international relations would be more familiar with. This Treaty of Westphalia is credited with the emergence of the nation-state system. What is a nation-state system? According to a nation-state system, or the principle of I'm sorry, there's a lot of crosstalk which is happening. I hope these are hello.
Yeah, Dr. Kulkarni, please keep your. No, you are also. Yeah, many others.
Not only should you keep your mic muted, but also ears open. When we the principle, according to the principle of nationality, which led to the formation of nation states. According to the principle of nationality, every nation or people will here defined as cultural community. For example, French are a people, German are a people. So people defined as a cultural category. So every nation or people had a right to form a state of their own, which meant cultural boundary could now overlap with political boundaries. Now, while this was a principle evolved to resolve the problem in Europe between the warring princes, These princes belonged to different sects of Christianity as well as different nationalities. The Treaty of Westphalia, by bringing in this principle of every nation had a right to form its own state, tried to resolve this problem. It brought peace in Europe, but it also was led to the emergence of the problem of the minorities. Because the moment you establish a nation state, a perfect kind of a overlap between culture and political boundaries could not be achieved. As a result, you had minorities living within the territories of nation states. These minority communities, such as, for example, the Jews, were looked with suspicion for their loyalty. Because since the nation was the foundational basis of state, or people were basis of state, those who were non-nationals or those who were non-people were considered to be a minority as well as their loyalty suspected. A similar crisis we are faced with today in India too, where a section of the minorities are today questioned for their loyalty. Increasingly, as the nation state acquires a monolithic character, it the other process which it unleashes is the process of minoritization. So when it acquires a monolithic character, it generally makes the culture of the dominant, the language of the dominant, the religion of the dominant as the national culture. And what it results it in then is the exclusion of minority. That is the process of minoritization. So the emergence of the minority problem, to a certain extent, one can take it to the principle of nation state, which emerged, and this was the principle on the basis of which Europe was reorganized. What was the basis for the extermination of the Jews in Germany? Hyper-nationalism of the Germans, which we know as fascism. It was in the 19th century, a significant, development known as the Dreyfus Affair. Colonel Alfred Dreyfus was a French officer in the French army, but he was Jewish by religion. He was arrested for espionage. A commission of inquiry actually, acquitted him, saying that Dreyfus is not the main culprit, but the main culprit was actually a French officer of non-Jewish. Yet Dreyfus continued to be in prison for a long period of time, around 10 years, when he was finally, released and acquitted. The Dreyfus Affair was a big event in that sense, which drew the European attention towards the minority question. You'll find it in Marx's writing too about Dreyfus Affair. That is the only, context in which where Marx writes on the Jewish question. That is the only context in which Marx actually refers to the minority question. So Dreyfus Affair was another important development, which led to the development of the idea of minorities and their specific problems. And these specific problems were largely emerging because of a surge of hyper-nationalism across Europe, which led to, in the Eastern Europe, in many places, including Russia, pogroms. The term pogrom actually has its origin from Eastern Europe, where a large number of Jews, again, were killed. This surge of nationalism also led to, the genocide in Armenia, the killing of the Armenians in the 1914-15, around First World War. Uh, and then you have the international community recognizing the minority question. So you have League of Nations as well as later on the United Nations recognizing rights of groups or communities or cultures which are considered to be uh, under threat, and simply on account of the differential culture practices they are you know excluded, discriminated against, etc. So there is a series of provisions which emerge in the League of Nations and later on in the United Nations too. The United Nations General Assembly finally adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Persons belonging to the national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. This was much later in 1992 because of a lot of debate also, as I suggested, that it has created sort of complexity too. So the question is not very easy to handle within state boundaries. Uh, Now, one of the reasons for the complexity, if you recall, in the early phase of this lecture itself, in the beginning itself, I refer to what is called the statistical issue or the numerical issue. Numbers do not resolve the problem. Why do the numbers do not resolve the problem? Is the classic case is of South Africa. In South Africa, in the apartheid South Africa, before the coming of Nelson Mandela and his party, the African National Congress, in the apartheid South Africa, you had the whites and the Africans ruling, whereas who were in a minority, but they had access or control over all segments of power, whether education, economy, culture, etc. And the rest of the population, which is the African native population, was subjected to dif- discriminatory treatments, including racial laws, etc. Now, in such a situation, if the whites of South Africa were to be considered as a minority, it defeated the purpose. So the South African case, and then when you come to Zimbabwe too, before Robert Mugabe introduced the reforms vis-a-vis which the white settlers were, you know, expected to, where vis-a-vis the large amounts of lands and estate owned by the white settlers were confiscated. It was the powerful minority, powerful community of whites, though lesser in number but extremely powerful. Similar, it could be the case of not now, not today, but say, for example, the Kashmiri Pandits before they began to be targeted. A section of the Kashmiri Pandits in Kashmir, though small in number compared to the rest of the population, but enjoyed corridors of power. They economically very strong. They were also into educational institutions. They were into bureaucracy and everywhere. I'm talking about this just to clarify. Before they began to be, uh, you know, uh, began to face the uh, violence of the militancy in Kashmir, but prior to that. Uh, as a result of such a situation where you have small groups, though small in number but yet powerful, this also created sort of a definitional ambiguity. And therefore, the reliance on statistics alone has increasingly now been given up. The minority question now is a question of power. It is argued that those who are powerless could be considered as a minority. But not everyone who is powerless. There are, you know, different kinds of communities. But powerless as a cultural category, as a cultural community. And this powerlessness results in further discrimination. Now, I will just refer to some of the definitions which have been very important in the understanding of minority. One of the earliest definition is of Louis Wirth, which you can see it on your screen. I have not given the entire definition, but just the synopsis of it, where Wirth argues that minority is a cultural community. Cultural community. This we need to remember. And why I'm saying this, it is important, is because if you go back to the earlier slides where I was referring to various different kinds of groups, women, sexual minorities, disabled, all being clubbed under minority. That is why I would try to argue that let us go back to the history. In what kind of a history does the concept of minority emerge? The concept of minority therefore emerged in the context of nation states, and thus the extermination of cultural communities which were not seen part of the nation state system. So Louis Wirth's definition says that minorities are a cultural community which are singled out from the others, from the dominant, for differential and unequal treatment. They're objects of collective discrimination, and they are also disadvantaged groups. So for Louis Wirth, again, the question of power is far more important than actually the numbers alone. However, at the same time, we also know about groups. There is also another level of complexity. That another level of complexity is that while certain groups wish to maintain their distinctive identity and they are insistent on cultural rights, but there are also certain groups who would like to join the national mainstream, and yet they are not accepted. So, visualizing a scenario such as this, Lepons brings in a sort of subjective also property in the definition of a minority, distinguishing between minorities by will and minorities by force. Minorities by will are those who are, as a community, wish to maintain their own distinctive identity and therefore demand or expect from the larger society a recognition of their distinctiveness. I don't know how many of you have read Charles Taylor's Politics of Recognition. Refers to this kind of a situation. The minority self here develops in relation with the majority. It sees itself as separate and yet in a certain kind of a relationship with the majority. On the other hand, there are also certain minority groups who may be culturally distinct but may not necessarily expect themselves to be declared as a minority. Say, for instance, the Parsis, both in India and Pakistan. A very small business community, extremely prosperous. And the Parsi representative in both in the Constituent Assembly of India as well as in the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan argued that they do not wish to have any special minority rights. Uh, that is a completely, so it can create two different kinds of situations, and visualizing that, Lepons therefore separates between minorities by will and minorities by force. Finally, I would refer to Myron Wenner, who actually argues that how distinctive group identity is important, that minorities are disadvantaged groups, that their deprivation also is self-defined. Sorry. So what is important here, which I'm trying to suggest, is that in all these definitions, if you see, there are two things which are extremely common. One, that minorities are cultural community, and secondly, that they are disadvantaged groups and are disadvantaged on account of being distinctive, culturally distinct. That is the situation. Uh, in India, again, the minority question is a complex one, even in terms of jurisprudence or legal kind of a situation. Article 29 and 30 extend the right to a minority to establish their own educational institutions in order to preserve their own culture. Article 29 and 30, many of you would be aware of it. But Article 29 and 30 does not define the criterion for defining a minority. So, who is a minority is not defined. It refers to religious or linguistic communities as a minority. But if you go back to my first slide, where I was referring to so many communities in different places could be a minority. So Article 29 and 30 do not help us in resolving that problem. As a result of this kind of a openness in Article 29 and 30, it has led to endless number of litigations, endless number of court cases. Mostly in all those cases, the discussion was around this. Are the minorities to be decided numerically in terms of numbers? If they are decided to be, if they are supposed to be decided by numbers, then at what level? At the level of state or at the level of at the national plane? It could be different. Say, for example, as I said, at the level of state, the Sikhs are a majority in Punjab, but at the national level, they're a minuscule minority, hardly 1 or 2% of the population. Well, this was in itself a sort of a confusion, and which has also led to protracted court battles. And finally, two court case judgments help us in arriving at some amount of understanding about who could be a minority in India. The Kerala Education Bill of 1958 resulted in court cases, etc. It ultimately resolved that minorities were less than 50% of the population of a given place. But this also didn't settle the question about at what level. Less than 50%, but at what level? At the level of district, at the level of state, at the level of the country as a whole. So finally, the TMA Pi judgment in 2002 determined that minorities were to be considered at the level of the state. So in that sense, the Pandits of Kashmir would be a minority in Kashmir because they are smaller in number, and also now, targeted ones. But TMA Pi judgment also has created a sort of an anarchy. It is an anarchic situation in the sense that every community now can claim itself to be a minority. In fact, in 2007, an Allahabad single judge bench of the Allahabad High Court gave a judgment which we could say was a resultant of this anarchy. It argued that, in fact, The in reference to the state of Uttar Pradesh, it argued that in fact the Muslims were the biggest majority in the country. It assumes Muslims or the practitioners of Islamic religion as homogeneous, which is sociologically, untenable. But the court judgment assumed the Muslims as a homogeneous community, whereas Hindus were seen as divided into various different castes, etc. And hence, they were a minority and the Muslims a majority. The This sort of a confusion has also resulted in, uh, majority itself becoming a redundant category. We do not know who then that how do we determine what is majority and therefore majoritarianism, which we are faced with today. So, there are problems in settling the question of minorities. Problems which have, because of a very turbulent past, turbulent history, the turbulent history of the emergence of minority in the context of wars and conflicts in Europe, I briefly referred to, but I did not refer to the turbulent history of the concept of minority in India. In India, it will actually emerge in the context of the discussions around partition, and you have various different efforts of extending minority rights in India too, emerging from 1909 Government of India Act, which recognized Muslims as a minority, extended the special provisions to them. The then 1916 Government of India Act, which also, extended this provision to the Sikhs in Punjab and certain other communities. Then we have Government of India Act 1935, which actually, you know, uh, brought the depressed castes and tribes in the name of scheduled castes also as groups for special attention. The question about minorities and Indian nationalism, the relationship between minorities and Indian nationalism, has also not been very easy one. The different kinds of nationalist ideology within India, and which sees the minorities in completely different ways. So I have listed some of them here. This is not an exhaustive list, and it is not actually completely compartmentalized, which means there could be overlaps between them. But just for analytical purpose, I'm trying to separate the hyper-nationalists, for example, from those who are secular nationalists or those who are the pluralists. Now, hyper-nationalism rests on kind of an argument which is suspicious of minority as a category in itself. The insistence of minorities on maintaining their distinctive identity, as well as their claims for equal treatment, share in power, share in national wealth, is subjected to certain kind of a uh, uh, you know suspicion, and therefore we see I, ideas about appeasement, ideas about falciparous tendencies, etc., emerging from these kinds of ideological groupings. So these are the hyper nationalists who see nation as a preserve of the majority culture, would like to build the nation in and around the national culture in and around uh, the the majoritarian culture. And here, the distinctiveness of the minority, the insistence of minority groups to maintain their own distinctive kind of cultural practice is questioned. Not only that, any effort on the part of the secular state to extend fruits of development to certain groups is also comes to be referred as a politics of vote bank, politics of appeasement, etc. You will this kind of a hyper nationalism at the plane at the national plane you can see in the slogans like Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, or even at the state levels, because India is also sort of a land of multiple nationalities. You can see it at the state level, for example, the Assamia nationalism, which is aggressively against any Bengali distinctiveness within Assam. Uh, Similarly, you will see in many of the northeastern states too such kind of a hyper nationalism prevailing in and around their own sort of a culture, and which actually dislikes the minority as an entity in itself. In the hypernationalist framework, in the 1960s, what emerged was referred to as the Indianization Thesis. According to this thesis, the distinctive cultural practices of minority groups need to be merged within the national culture. They needed to be assimilated so as to ensure their loyalty. The maintenance of distinctive practice was seen itself as a cause for certain kind of disloyalty. So the call was therefore that minorities needed to be Indianize themselves. And what was the framework of being Indianized? Is the majority culture. In this thesis, you will also see a distinction maintained between those which are Indic and those which are non-Indic. The Indic cultures and religions are those which are considered to be born in India, and non-Indic cultures and religions are those which are considered to be born outside of India. Those which are considered to have been born outside of India, say for example Christianity and Islam, are considered to have extraterritorial loyalties and hence a sort of a suspicious category. This kind of a distinction is or had its origin in the thoughts of Hindu nationalist leader Savarkar, who distinguished between those who had the religious communities who had India as their fatherland, and those who had both Holy Land as well as fatherland in India. The most trusted were those, and most national were those who had both the fatherland as well as Holy Land in India, which means the Pitri Bhumi and the Punya Bhumi. Whereas those who had only the Pitri Bhumi and not the Punya Bhumi in India had loyalties which were not the terminal loyalty for the Indian nation state, and hence a suspected category. This Indic versus non-Indic distinctions we can see maintained in various different academic discussions, as well as it has also entered some kind of certain constitutional provisions. For example, Article 341. In Article 341, scheduled castes, the Article 341 extends reservation to the scheduled castes. Appended to Article 351 is also a list, a scheduled list. And Clause 3 of the Article 341 says that only uh, the former untouchable communities or castes practicing Hinduism could be listed amongst the scheduled caste. It made only two amendments in this clause. One was for the Sikhs in 1956, if I remember correctly, and the Neo Buddhists in 1990. Both Sikhs and the Buddhists are Indic, along with the Hindus, whereas the non Indic religious communities and the untouchable groups within these non Indic cultural communities, such as Christianity and Islam, continue to be denied the provision of scheduled castes. And therefore, you see the Dalit Muslim and Dalit Christian politics which has emerged in recent times. So, well, we were discussing hyper-nationalist and the Indianization thesis. The secular nationalists also seek a certain kind of a, homogeneity, but this is on terms of modernity. The secular nationalists are suspicious of all kinds of identities which are considered as primordial. So, whether religious or caste, they emphasize on secularism based on French Licite. In the French Licite tradition, there is a wall of separation between religion and politics, between state and religion. Religion is completely pushed to the private domain, whereas the public domain of politics as well as state, etc., is free of religion as well as religious symbolism. And that is why in France you have a problem of hijab, you have a problem of Sikhs wearing the turban, or even others. The secular nationalists would like to see a secularism of that kind, but at the same time, they too are, you know, suspicious of cultural distinctiveness, and hence they would expect abrogation of personal laws, abrogation of religious schools, etc. Completely opposed to both the secular nationalists as well as the hyper nationalists are the pluralists. The pluralists are those who emphasize on composite culture. They, emphasize on everyday religiosity, such as Sufism and Bhakti tradition. One of the classic practitioner of pluralist, you can say, was Mahatma Gandhi, who found that who did not advocate the secularization of religion, but what he believed or practiced was a sort of a religiosity which was plural in character. In this composite culture thesis, India is an amalgamation of multiple cultures and multiple cultural practices, all needed to thrive without necessarily having any particular national culture. Well, uh, so therefore, their relationship with minority too is completely different. However, at the same time, the pluralists are critiqued for the fact that they advocate preservation of culture. While culture may also be a domain of, tradition, prejudices, as well as particularly in relation to women, uh, gender unjust practices, etc. So, well, these are how we can see analytically separate different kinds of nationalist groupings and their relationship with the idea of minorities. I wish to make two formulations here as to how do we see the question of minorities as. The first formulation which I wish to advance is that minorities are contextually produced, and in this contextual production of minorities, violence is key to it. So while we know that there is a huge diversity in terms in India, and while we know that there are different areas in which different kinds of cultural groupings may be in domination, such as the Assamese in Assam, the Bengalis in Bengal, the Tamils in Tamil Nadu, and each of them being very insistent on protecting their own ethnic homeland. But in what situation is a minority or minoritization produced? Now, as a Bengali, I might be in a dominant position within Bengal vis-a-vis others, but I may not be the same. Say, example in Assam, where I could be a targeted minority. As a Hindi speaker in much of North India, I might see myself as possessor of the idea of the nation state itself, because Hindi also is considered to be the official language and things like that. Hello, is there a question or they're cross talking? Hello.
Yeah, that was crosstalk. Please, everyone mute. Mr. Galeppa, can you please mute?
सर नो क्वेश्चन सर नो क्वेश्चन
प्लीज म्यूट. आप अपना आवाज बंद कर लीजिए, डिस्टर्ब हो
हाँ
रहा है.
सर थैंक यू
All right, all right. I'm only suggesting that आवाज तो बंद कर लें, पर जो कान है उनको खड़े कर लें थोड़ा. तो ears open and yeah, the mic muted. It hasn't helped. Hello.
हेलो
All right. So what I was trying
Please
to
continue, sir, please.
yeah. So the two formulations which I am trying to put forward is one, that minorities are contextually produced. So in different contexts, there could be different groups who can face being powerless as well as minoritized. So if the Hindi speakers in North India might see themselves as part of a majority culture, but when they go to Maharashtra, they are referred to as Biharis very often, and also targeted by certain Maratha organizations for stealing their jobs, which are meant to them, son of soil movement and all that. They also sometimes targeted violently. And so minoritization, or being a minority, is a reference to a context in which we are there. This context is a context of unequal power distribution, of dominance and subordination, and key to the production of a minority. Who becomes a minority? The key to it is violence. Very often it is when we are faced with violence on account of our language, our religion, etc., that we realize that we are a minority. We face a situation similar to the minorities in different parts of the world. So, for example, Tamil speakers in Karnataka during the language riots, as I referred to Bengalis in Assam, Sikhs, who was seen as integral to the Indian nation state, faced this in 1984. They were targeted, and the minoritization of Sikhs began. So minorities are contextually produced. In different junctures of history, there could be different communities which can face uh, being in a minority situation. And violence actually is, I'm referring to collective violence, is the mechanism through which this minoritization takes place. The second formulation which I wish to offer is that both minority and majority are relational categories, which means if there is a minority, it cannot exist without the idea of a majority. So if minority is a subordinate group, majority is the dominant group. But there is a sort of a relation between the two of them. The relationship is of domination and subordination. So to think of a minority is to think of a majority as well. And similarly, if there are majoritarian tendencies, there also has to be a minority situation. So neither of these two categories exist without each other. All right. So if I'm referring to someone as a minority, in that context, there has to be a community which is seen as a majority, which, all right, with all the attributes of what a majority is. Uh, Having laid this foundation, finally, I'll talk about three different kinds of minorities. This is my suggestion of how to, resolve the complexity of the minority problem. I argue that there are three different kinds of cultural communities who could be considered as a minority. The first kind of a cultural community are the nationalities. India is home to multiple nationalities. Each nationality associates itself with a homeland which it considers to be the ancestral homeland. It is seen as the sacred homeland of that nationality in question. Say, for example, the Meiteis of Manipur, the Nagas of Nagaland, the Mizos, the Bengalis, the Assamese, the Tamils, the Kannars, and all. These are distinct nationalities, and they see particular part of the country as their homeland. The nationalities have completely different kinds of expectations. Those nationalities which see themselves as neglected have made a range of demands. Some of them expect, autonomy of governance, of determining their own politics and culture. Some of them also went into armed struggle, such as the Nagas and the Mizos, as well as the Bodos. The kind of solution which Indian state has offered to them is the creation of ethnic homelands. So, for example, for the Bodos, the Bodo land was created after the Bodo Accord. For the Nagas, the Naga land. And for the Mizos, after the Mizo Accord, Mizoram was carved out in areas inhabited by the Mizos. But the creation of ethnic homelands has created its own problem. For example, in Bodoland, a large population, the population living within Bodoland, are those who belong to the T tribes, or those who are Bengalis, both Bengalis Hindus and Bengali Muslims. In fact, the Bodos within Bodoland, it is said, are 30 to 35% of the population only. But the Bodos see the Bodoland as after it being recognized as a Bodoland, see it as their ethnic homeland. And as a result, there has been a process of ethnicization or cleansing of Bodo land from other cultural communities. So there have been violence against the tribes as well as against the Bengalis, Hindus, and Muslims. Similarly, you see the problem in Mizoram. The creation of Mizoram resolved the Mizo demand for self-determination rights, but it also has led to the minoritization of various other communities which were not seen as Mizo but residing within the same territory, such as the Riangs. Apart from the nationalities, we have another, type of community, cultural community, which can be referred to as a minority. These are the indigenous groups or tribes. They're smaller in number compared to the nationalities. They too have an idea of a territory or a land, which is the home of the tribe. But they have not risen the, to the level of declaring themselves as a nation. What they expect is the protection of their language, culture, script, idea of religion, etc. The Indian Constitution offers Schedule 5 and Schedule 6. These are the areas in which the indigenous groups or tribes can have control over their own land, resources, etc. Besides, there is also a provision of reservation to ensure their share in the national development. But of late, the areas inhabited by the tribes, particularly in the central India, which is the Chota Nagpur Plateau, etc., which is seen as mineral, which is home to the mineral wealth, is now targeted by the mining companies, multinational mining companies with huge capital, and aided by the government. And as a result, now there is a process of extermination of these tribes from their own areas and land. There is a lot of resistance in Orissa, in Chhattisgarh, in Jharkhand, and this has made the problem which needs attention and resolution. The third kind of a minority is the dispersed minority. The dispersed minority does not have any claim over land, any particular area of land. It does not see it as nation. Neither does it see itself as a tribe. The dispersed minorities are to be found in different parts of the country. Largely, the religious communities can be seen as present in different parts of the country, in particularly minority religious communities. They do not have any specific claim over the land. Similarly, you will see the language speakers outside their, linguistic zones, such as, the Tamils in Delhi, the Bengalis, as I said, in Assam or other places. These are dispersed minorities. And their expectations are completely different. They expect cultural protection, security is something, because being dispersed, not living within any confined territory. There are also targets of violence occasionally. And hence, security is one of the major issues which the dispersed minorities face. Besides, there are also certain communities amongst dispersed minorities, for example, the Muslims, also face structural violence. The structural violence is different from symbolic violence. The structural violence is more, enduring. The structural violence is systemic violence, whereby it means that certain communities continue to be underdeveloped, face discrimination in various different aspects of, society. It is structural violence, not physical violence as such, but structural violence also leads to physical violence. So we see there is occasional interreligious riots, which Paul Brass calls it as anti-minority pogroms, because they suffer the most. So this is a sort of you can see a typology of three different kinds of minorities with three different kinds of expectations. And the minority problem could be resolved by attending to this specificity of problem which each of these minorities have. So rather than having a uh, sort of a one size fits all kind of a solution, it requires specific attention. So nationalities have a different kind of expectation and a resolution mechanism. The tribes completely different, and dispersed minorities a completely different kind of expectation. Uh, with this, I would also, therefore, I argue this question about loyalty, that minorities are uh, you know considered to be disloyal uh, is something which needs to be given up. A different kind of an attitude needs to be developed, in which the relationship between the two, the majority and the minority, made more congenial by attending to certain specificity of the minority needs. These specificities, as I was suggesting, say, for example, now all figures, government surveys, national sample survey, as well as commissions of inquiry report, etc., show that amongst the religious minorities, Muslims face the most amount of underdevelopment. Their numbers in informal sector is disproportionately high. Their numbers in the middle class is disproportionately low. Their share in public employment as well as private employment is substantially lesser. Their numbers in poverty ratios is huge, and hence they require a completely different kind of a targeted development. The same is not the situation with the other minorities, for example, the Sikhs or the Christians, who do not face that level of underdevelopment, although a section of the Christians and the Sikhs might be facing it. But their expectations are different. Security, religious autonomy uh, are far more important uh, for them. So therefore, what I'm emphasizing upon is targeted development and specificity of needs, and accordingly, sort of policy instruments to be developed which meets those specificities. A nuanced approach is what I'm trying to argue might be helpful in actually comprehending as well as resolving the question of minorities in India as well as in different parts of the world, wherever it has appeared. I'm sure this is a topic which actually might be, provoking a lot of questions. So I'll stop here. There are some minutes left. I hope you were able to listen it clearly as well as carefully. Uh, I pass the mic on to the organizers, Professor Shahid Raza or Khwaja Zia, whoever is present. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you, Professor Fazal Saab. Now I would like to participate that if somebody has some any queries or question, they may ask. Professor Fazal will provide the response. Now session is open for the question hour.
May I go?
Yeah,
Sir?
please raise your hand and ask the question.
Hello, sir. This is Dr. Saman Afroz from Mumbai, Nirmala Niketan. Just now you were talking about Muslims as being one of the most underdeveloped minorities in our country, and
Religious minority, yeah.
religious, of course, religious minority. And you were talking about targeted development for them. Can you focus more on what kind of targeted development can be done?
Well, it depends upon what kind of need is there in different areas and regions. For example, in say compared to eastern and northern India, the southern India, the development of minorities is comparatively better. I'm not saying that absolute terms, but in relational terms.
Mhm.
Well, eastern and northern India, they need to be, certain specific programs which actually, resolves their material needs, educational needs. You need to
Mhm.
have far more number of schools in minority concentrated areas.
Mhm.
You need to have more fund flows to, say, for example, a good section of the minorities, particularly Muslim minorities, are self-employed. And
Mhm.
self-employed, although Ambani is also self-employed, but these are the people who are, say, in self-employed in petty work. And we need
Mhm.
to extend support to them in variety of ways, skill training, as well as you know disbursement of loan for entrepreneurship, good marketing facilities for artisans. Large number of Muslim population is involved in
Mhm.
artisanal work. So yeah,
Mhm.
it is a whole range of things in packages,
All
but
right.
depending
Mhm.
on what is a specific need in
Mhm.
particular region.
Mhm. All right. Thank you, sir. It was a
Yep.
very, very informative session. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Afroz.
Good morning, sir.
Govindappa, yes.
Yes, sir. Very good morning, sir.
Good morning.
And good morning to one and all. I am Govindappa from HD Kote, Assistant Professor. Sir, my observation is you've gone through that Christian minorities. In the Christian minorities, the linguistic minority, especially Dalit Christians and Wakaliga Christians and so many caste-based Christians. Actually, in Karnataka nowadays, it is a really it is a bad development. That is, the Christian minority is growing well, but they are particularly naming the caste name. Is it any article is there to control that the minority, especially the caste-based minorities?
Well, I couldn't exactly get your question, but what I assume is you're referring to, say, Dalit Christians and Dalit Christians basically here in this case.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
sir.
Well, I wouldn't say such, I don't know what you mean by controlling, but the Dalit Christians are those who are also in terms of caste, of similar caste as those who are recognized as scheduled caste. But
Yes,
but simply on account of them being Christian, they are denied the facility of being scheduled caste.
yes, sir.
So
Yes, sir.
there is a case pending in the Supreme Court
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The only
Exactly.
issue here is the withdrawal of the presidential order of 1950.
Okay.
It has to be an executive decision. It doesn't need any kind of a parliamentary amendment. But for lack of political will, it has not been entertained as so far. And there are also various different kinds of objections to it, which in a different separate kind of session I could discuss. All right. So the immediate issue is, of course, their recognition as scheduled caste, so that they also, although facing same level of material deprivation as well as social discrimination, but they do not get entitlements. So that at least is recognized. All right.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there any question? Now I would like to invite Dr. Zia to give vote of thanks to Professor Fazal.
Yeah.
If time, do we have time? 5 minutes, Shai?
Yeah.
So I had a small further clarification that how do we locate this the issue of linguistic minorities within Indian states, which you have referred in detail. But then when the issues of their schooling, the providing schools like Telugu schools, have a Telugu medium school in Delhi. But part of these issues, which is in different states, are troubling to many other majorities, majority within that state. So how do we locate this issue sociologically or from the lens of social scientists?
No, there is a provision, of course, you're right, that linguistic minorities can establish their own schools. And we have similar kind of schools in different places. The thing is that all communities may not necessarily be in a position to establish their own schools. A certain amount of economic development is also required to sustain their own educational institutions. In that situation, the government should be forthcoming. Earlier, there was a practice, of course, of government also extending funding to minority educational institutions. And there is a Supreme Court decision also regarding that the government cannot stop funding simply on account of an institution being a minority institution. So the Supreme Court judgment, etc., also provisions the state to allows the state to fund minority educational institutions, even if they are not owned by the government, but through grants. So one of the ways is by doing that. Besides, you see, the question about when you said that when the minorities establish their own schools, they have problem from the majority. That needs to be very clearly spelled out. I am not a educationist as such, do not look so much into education or pedagogy and other things. But at one point of time, I was wondering whether multicultural education can be helpful, whereby being sensitive to the population demography of a region, school education could offer option for learning in learning different languages within the school itself. The 3-language formula was an interesting one in that sense, but then now that is being violated through again another kind of a majoritarianism. I'm told that in the 3-language formula, it is being insisted that Hindi, of course, has to be taught, English, without which you can't do, and it is important. And then there is a whole concerted effort, and then you're left with only one language. So the whole, whichever dominant minority is there, dominant community is there, would like to have their own language being taught in the school. For example, in Telangana, if you're teaching English, you're teaching Hindi, you're only left with Telugu. So there is no space for any other language to be introduced. Uh, so there are problems there which needs to be resolved, but this only can be resolved if majoritarian tendencies are also arrested, without which it may not be. Why is Hindi being imposed everywhere? It is not a national language. So what is being imposed everywhere? Uh, so that is the question which we need to address. So there are different ways in which it can be handled. The cultural needs of linguistic minorities.
So with this fine presentation, we cannot and we could not have much elaborative talk on the issues of minorities conceptually, statistically, and in the context of nation state, which we debate in social science. With the time restrictions we have, because 11:30 we have another session, so we cannot take more questions. But I profoundly found this session, and I'm sure that all of us in the course would have enjoyed, learned, and will carry forward with new ideas on minorities. I thank you so much, Professor Tanweer Fazal, on behalf of HRDC, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, and Professor Shahid Raja, that you agreed to deliver a talk. And I'm happy that this session was for 1.5 years. Usually, when we discuss with you, 20-15 minutes doesn't work out on the issue. So I am sure that you would have found this interesting. I mean, in terms of time frame we have, and we look forward for more engaging and meaningful talk in future as well. Because now this was perhaps the first talk for HRDC, and it's a welcome talk for Professor Tanweer Fazal at Maulana Azad National Urdu University, because he is now at Hyderabad Central University. Until 2 years back, he was in Delhi, and it was very difficult to take your consent and persuade you to travel Hyderabad. Now this would be much easier for HRDC and all of us to have your talk very frequently, and also for students in future. So once again, I thank you so much, and we look forward for more meaningful engagement.
Well, thank you, everyone. I hope that all of you had some amount of engagement with this. And also thanks for the time which was maintained both by the organizers. We started dot on time, and I think it's 11:30 when we are closing it. So thank you, everyone, and all the best.